Chair of the Board of the Craft Council of British Columbia, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first speaking event at the Vancouver Public Library. I've been here often for opera forums, and I know you're in for a treat. It's wonderful events that happen here. We're talking this evening on craft and our community. We would like to thank Daniela and Amber and the staff of the library for making this possible. This is the Council's first cooperative event with the Vancouver Public Library, and it is their tremendous support and assistance that has allowed us to address one of our mandates, that being public outreach, providing opportunities to learn all about the aspects of craft and how important it is for society and community. And I'd also like to thank Bill Ewan from the Craft Council, who has put a tremendous amount of work into making this possible. Bill, I know you're here, and Amber and Julie, and there's other representatives and members of the Craft Council who are here this evening, so thank you so much for coming out. And I also would like to thank my colleague and friend Bettina for all her time preparing for this evening and for making this evening's talk possible. Bettina is a very prolific artist. She teaches as a sessional instructor at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, gives talks and workshops all across our province, exhibits nationally and internationally, and writes professionally on the arts. Some of you who follow Canadian film may know her from directing 3 award-winning animated films using textiles for the National Film Board of Canada. On your chair, you will find a survey regarding future programming which will help us in planning upcoming events. Please take a moment to fill it out. It only takes a few minutes of your time, and in return for your opinions, we will email you a discount coupon for our shop Craft House on Granville Island. And I'd also like to point out that in our haste, the question number 2 is actually not on the form. So you are asked to circle your response, but the question is, how did you hear about tonight's event? After Bettina's presentation, you will have some time to walk around and look at her work. There should be a question and answer period. And ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to present Bettina Matzkun.
I like the word embroidery because it seems to conjure excess and exaggeration, as in an embroidered tale. I sort of have in common with fishermen, you know, describing things that got away or embellishing things. My work, hopefully, is aesthetic and visually appealing, but for me it has to be about something, and I don't want to be prescriptive about how to make art, but for me, I'm constantly thinking, so my work is kind of an equivalent of talking or telling stories. I grew up seeing my grandmothers and mothers sew and knit, and I was very fond of the old ice box that my mother had, this wooden ice box that she had filled with fabric scraps. And they were all tied neatly with a strand of the same fabric. Since I was an only child, I also got to spend a lot of time with my dad looking at maps and boat stuff and weather and overhearing him talk about growing up in Berlin during the Second World War. At the library, there's a book called My One and Only that's about being an only child, and I found that really reassuring. We're socially awkward, but we're really good at entertaining ourselves. I've always been a reader, but the idea for doing concerted research for a body of visual work really started around 1991, when for my birthday, my mother gave me a duotang with a tight story about her mother's family and her own family. So both my parents were German immigrants, and she gave it to me at a time that was sort of critical. I had my own 2 children, and when you're young, you're not that interested in your family, you know, they're just there. But as I got older and had my own kids, I suddenly wanted to know more about them. For a long time, I'd rejected my German heritage. I wouldn't wear brown. I hated my name because I thought it might identify that I was somehow connected to them. And I effectively stopped speaking German when I was 7 because I just didn't want to be associated with it. He wanted to get as far away from Germany as possible, so I think I kind of inherited a bit of that. wanting the distance. So when my mother gave me this story, it was about her mother's treadle sewing machine. And she used it for survival during the war and after the war, which in some ways was worse. And her husband wound up in West Germany and she was in East Germany and she wanted to join him. So she ended up carrying it across the border. You try that sometime. So I read many books about Nazi Germany, and some notable ones were Born Guilty, Mothers in the Fatherland, The Inability to Mourn, about how after the war the Germans had perpetrated such awful things but had also lost so much that it was this psychological nightmare. And I also listened to CBC Karen Levine's audio interviews with children of SFU, which is a very conceptual school, but I really enjoyed myself when I was at school. And I learned to write, which was important to me, and to organize my thoughts and funnel this into my visual work. So the sewing machine project had about 20 pieces in it. Friedrich Wilhelm was picked up and put in a Russian prison camp after the war when he was 14, and he also died there. And then my mother moved to Canada, so effectively abandoning her parents. And I think when you have your own children, you sort of have an inkling of how that must feel. My father came to live with my mom's family. It's a long story, but he came from Berlin, and so this was his childhood, was going into bomb shelters all the time. Often had sort of domestic fabric, so you can see the placemats, that sort of thing. And the piece, the series as a whole, maybe didn't hang together all that well, but I think as an artist it's really important to keep working, to keep doing things, because that's how you learn and that's how you sort of refine your work. This piece, finally, after all my research and all my thinking, what really began as a story about my grandparents invariably turned into a self-examination. How do you judge people who can't reply? And what would I have done in their place? Would I have sheltered my neighbors? Would I have protested the regime? Would I have just tried to get by to feed my family? So really doing all this, I ended up learning more about myself than anything else. A friend, when she saw this piece, and it's pinned up at the back, you can look at it later, seeing the measuring tape along the side as the border, she said, "You're measuring yourself." So as I was doing research and thinking about things, one of the librarians at the SFU library gave me a really good tip, and he said, when you find a book that you think is really interesting, look in their bibliography, because they'll have other things that they looked at. So it's like you've got a whole list of things to go on to. And the other thing is, you do your research, make sure you keep lots of notes of where you found things, because it's crazy hard to go back and find things if you haven't put a page myself and get my teeth fixed, this kind of thing. But one of the really great things, besides working with bright and witty colleagues, is that there's an endless parade of books. So I'm constantly picking up books, and there will be books about things you never thought somebody would write about. One that came across the desk was by Hans-Erik Nossack about the fire, that here's this massive destruction that people have caused, and yet the inhabitants of the earth, the flora, is actually trying to revive itself. One of my favorite books is Alice Munro's The Progress of Love, and there's a copy of it over there, and the cover has Alex Colville's painting of an old tree on it. And somehow the two things combined in my mind, so I stole the title, and there's no copyright on titles, so you can do that. So I borrowed this title for this image. I was working on a series about how trees with their limbs and trunks are almost human. and they'll often influence one another's growth. Thomas Pakenham has written a book called Meetings with Remarkable Trees. I think there's actually a second book to it. And John Fowles, who wrote The French Lieutenant's Woman and The Collector, they made the movie, kind of creepy movie. He wrote this wonderful book called The Tree, with really thoughtful writings, talking about how his father always wanted everything neat and tidy and the trees pruned and everything just so, and Fowles himself found that the messiness and the exuberance of trees was more important for him. So these things weren't hardcore research, but they kept me company, and I think that's what books do for me, is they keep me involved in how other people think. Anyway, years ago I wrote an article about a woman who's a potter, and she was making replicas for someone's project of Greek vessels, and she said as she was making them on her wheel, she felt the same physical motion that the Greek potters must have felt 2,500 years ago. And I found that really interesting, that the physical memory of doing something is something that spans a long time. So when I sew, I think the same thing. The Chinese women who embroidered the emperor's robes, and the Afghani women that sew the beautiful little dresses, that there's something, the same motion and the same focus and fascination that we share. This is an embroidered map of Srinagar. Every time I go to museums, I'm always looking for interesting textiles. And maps have been something that have featured in my work for a long time. This definition of narrative, and I see maps as the perfect thing for narrative. Arden Atwood says, narrative is one damn thing after another, with the operative word being after. She talks about events occurring in relation to one another. So this doesn't mean a linear progression, but like a big, broad building up. And that's what I like about maps, is they evoke this broad sense of passage. You can say, I was here yesterday, and I'm here now, and I'm going to go there tomorrow. So it's a big sort of thing. I also like Alberto Mangel's book, Reading Pictures. He writes, when we read pictures, in fact, images of any kind, whether painted, sculpted, photographed, built, or performed, we bring to them the temporal quality of narrative. We extend that which is limited by a frame to a before and an after, and through the craft of telling stories, we lend the immutable picture an infinite and inexhaustible life. So I love that idea of the before and after in an image, and I think maps are one way of containing that. Did films for the film work. I saw it as a kind of apprenticeship, because I had to work really closely with the materials. I had to figure out how they would look under the camera, how to move them. I would embroider things and film them, or move little cutout pieces I had made. So, the whole quality of things that were shiny or fuzzy or rough, or it made me pay really close attention to that. The third film had as its centerpiece this 8 by 11 foot map of Canada, which is now in the collection of the Surrey Art Gallery. In many ways, this was inspired by the book Canada, A Year of the Land, which I think came out in the centennial year. And there's a copy of it over there somewhere. I cycled from Ontario to Halifax. I'd driven across Canada and taken the train many times, but I was keenly aware of only seeing that strip along the 49th parallel. So I wanted the map to be a kind of space where things could take off, where I could tell a story about different parts of the country. Oh. There we are. So the map had, before I began working on a group of pieces featuring architectural drawings of sailboat hulls. Since boats are referred to as she, the skeletal hulls seem to imply something fragile and feminine. I referred to the Tide Current Atlas and other navigational books to find some sort of visual context to put these boats in. They're wonderful books on marine architecture. The smaller thing where you have the bow and the stern at the same time I like, because it's like it's coming and going at the same time. I was also reading Natalie Goldberg's book, Writing Down the Bones, which is about writing, but I think all the artistic, creative disciplines overlap, and I find inspiration in all these different facets. She talks about metaphor, and I think for an artist, metaphor is the biggest wrench you've got in your tool, the oneness in an ant and an elephant. So when I use the drawings of the boats and trees, I'm thinking of humans. It was around then I started seriously looking at charts that were familiar to me from childhood on boats and poring over books of old marine maps. Today you can find all kinds of maps online, and the New York Public Library has a fabulous map collection that you can see online. Libraries such as the VPL have map drawers where you can borrow maps and look at them. It's great fun. At this time, maybe I should toot the horn of librarians. They don't know everything, but they can find you everything. They can find you things you never thought were there. And if your branch doesn't have it, they can get it from another system. They can interlibrary loan it. They can get it from the ends of the earth for a small fee. They can suggest databases to check out, and databases are great because it's really current information. It takes a while to publish a book, but a magazine article can be posted quite quickly on a database. And the most important thing is they can tell you what keywords to use if you're looking for something. So if you're looking for cooking and you put in cooking, if that's not the Library of Congress term, I think it's cookery. And if you don't use the right term, you're not going to come up with as much stuff. So if you're not coming up with things, it doesn't mean that the material isn't there. If you talk to a librarian and say, oh, well, you want this term. And actually, if you find a book that you like, and it's on the catalog index on the computer, you can usually see the subject headings there, and they're usually live, so you can click on them and it'll direct you to other books on those subjects. It's like the librarians are your best guide to it. So looking at these old Portolano charts, of course I didn't look at the real ones, except in the British Museum, but these are the kind that Columbus's brother secreted to him from the Portuguese court. The shape I learned was because they were drawn on vellum, which is calf skin. The wind roses were spread around the map so that a mariner would dead reckon where he was, and then pick one of the roses that were near where he thought he was, and then he would find the direction of where he wanted to go and see the degree on the compass rose and then transfer that to his own compass on his ship. So it was pretty seat of the pants kind of navigation. In another book about contemporary maps, You Are Here, and I brought my copy of that there, I stumbled on a visual interpretation of Lewis Carroll's Hunting of the Snark. I like the idea that there's nothing there, but the crew were pleased because it was something they could understand. And sometimes to me it seems like we have all these devices, we have GPSs and our iPhones and maps and Google and everything to find our way, and yet still there's no land in sight. I feel that a lot of my work is about confusion, about what to do next, where to go. So this map of the ocean, essentially took all the land out of it and just left the compass roses. So also amongst the Portolano charts, we'll just go back to that one, you can see that along the coastlines are little words, cities. And when the sailors mapped the coastlines, they were quite familiar with the coast and all the little towns along it, and they would indicate all those. So when they didn't know anything about the interior, they just invented stuff. So in my little crab-like brain, I thought about how when you first meet someone, it's like coming to a coastline, and you can make up these words about them, and then you can think about what might be farther inland, but you don't really know. And you can make up those things at your peril. But I started collecting adjectives to use that describe a person to make this coast. So of course my colleagues at the library jumped right in with that, like feckless and smarmy and all these kind of wonderful words. From a small calendar day book I brought at the British Library. So I'm like a magpie, I just gather things, and the embroidery is just an opportunity to recombine them and draw attention to details and fabricate more stories. A friend who's a PhD in women's studies emailed me the title of this book, Clélie, which contains La Carte de Temps. It's a map about relationships from a woman's point of view, and it was devised by Madame de Scudéry and her pals that attended her salon in Paris in the late 1700s. I like the Lake of Indifference and the territory, the Terre Inconnue. And there's all kinds of little strange places indicated in there. But I like this idea again of a sort of a more emotional kind of map. So it led to making the Romantic Archipelago. And again, with the title, I was thinking of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. So romance is a kind of exotic gulag as a fraught territory. So I threw in modern conventions such as the shipping lanes with two ships blasting their cannons at each other, and sheer fantasy of the end of the world, and a choice selection of sea monsters. He's sort of my mascot. There's another one around the corner here. So it's maybe an updated version of La Carte de Temps. And again, the librarians, interlibrary owned it from a university, so it was fun to have the copy of the book. In one book, as I was doing research on maps, an author discussed maps used by the Air Force in World War II that were printed on silk so that airmen could tuck them in their pocket, and if they had to bail over enemy territory, they had a basic map on where they were and how to get out. I went online and I found a guy who was selling books about these, so that's something I might pursue sometime, the sort of escape maps. I think it's good when you're researching something and thinking about a project to cast your net really wide. Even if you don't end up using something, it's, well, if you're a slow thinker like I am, it'll stay there for a while. Another thing I found interesting were the old strip maps. So a strip map, like you could take the top of the left-hand side and put it on the bottom of the next strip. So you could glue all those strips together to make a long map. They're not concerned with being oriented to the north or any kind of accuracy of direction, but they're simply documenting a road or a voyage. Apparently, strip maps were found on the bottom of Egyptian coffins to guide the deceased in the afterlife. You never know when you might need one. It's not a strip map, but this long spool was a map that I made in I took the bicycle trip in 1998. I rode my bicycle from here to the Yukon. And I made this spool about 23 meters long, so it was a centimeter for every kilometer. And every day, if I rode, say, 100 kilometers, I would count off 100 centimeters, and then I would draw on that portion of the spool. And much later, I started to embroider it the way your memory embroiders memory, right? Some things you remember, some things you forget. So, you know, certain landscapes I remember, certain places where they were doing road work and it was all rubble, I forget. I did this as a directed studies project for my BFA, and part of that project was an essay discussing how other artists made work about traveling, whether far afield or simply in the neighborhood. So I was really inspired by different artists' work on traveling. I recently made a map of my bike commute to work, and it's only about 8 kilometers. But I lined a box with the map, but in the lid of the box is the legend that explains the map, and the legend became bigger and bigger, so the legend's about 2.5 meters long, so I had to roll it up and put it in the lid. I like the idea of mapping the mundane, of simple things. Of that school. I also made a map to go with the school, and I wanted to indicate some of the many kindnesses people offered me on that trip. Before I left, people were saying, "Well, they're going to steal your bike, and bears are going to eat you and stuff." And people were really, really kind to me, and they'd offer me money, food, showers, ride in a canoe, and so I made up little symbols ranging from coffee and conversation to advice on the road ahead. But I chronicled my emotional condition in relation to the road, so sometimes it was euphoric and sometimes despairing. If you look at a book like You Are Here and Maps as Art, a lot of artists use maps as kind of emotional indicators or to indicate psychological conditions. So I was thinking about, especially as an artist, when you finish a project, you feel kind of and that sort of blah feeling. You're not clinically depressed, but you're just kind of blue. And I thought about how that's a passage that you kind of ride it down the river and come out the other end. So a river with those big sandbanks kind of winds around, and again, the library staff came through with words. My very favorite was, instead of latitude and longitude, they came up with languitude and lassitude. In 2008, I did an artist residency at the Banff Center, and belonging to a group like the Craft Council, they'll send bulletins about artist residencies, or librarians can find new websites and information on applying for artist residencies. It's a great way to have concerted time to work on a certain project. Before I went, I was looking at things about the national parks, and I had read about the problems in Banff about human-animal interactions in Canadian Geographic, and I can't afford a lot of subscriptions, so the library is a great resource. You can take out all kinds of magazines and the newest up-to-date ones. So I emailed ahead to the national parks in Banff and arranged an appointment, and Heather Dempsey, who was the educator person at the time, spent an hour with me showing me all these different things that the parks had done to help bears and creatures go above or below the highway, and showed me different maps and photos that talked about this work that they did. So I started doing maps that had two layers. You can see underneath, all those little tracks were from a map she showed me where they had documented animal tracks. And of course, animals will want to live in the same place that the humans live, sort of lower in the valley where there's stuff to eat. The barren peaks, not so much. But the highway is something that's overlaid on this map, so it's on a second sheer layer covering the animal tracks. And also the city of Banff applied to the parks for more room so they could build more housing for people who work in the park, and there was a big to-do over that. And finally it was approved, so the part south of the river there was new construction. And what the parks got in exchange was a little patch of land that was a no-go zone for humans. And of course it was on a hillside, which probably the animals didn't want. But I just thought it was so funny, this little patch that's sort of reserved for creatures. Humans can't go there. So as I was looking at all these materials, I went in the tourist bureau and picked up all these maps and was looking at them, and it occurred to me that on many of the maps, it's all about human comfort, human entertainment, human safety, and that animals are sort of this incidental nuisance. So in the center one at the very bottom, there's a little elk, and that's because people sometimes run into them and damage their cars. So the elk is kind of incidental. And on the one on the far right, the only animal, this is a Parks Board map, the only animal that was on there was a fish that had been caught. On the map of the ice fields, second from the right, and the marine map, second from the left, the maps describe the land, but essentially so we can make our way around it. They're quite beautiful. And the one on the left is all the don't ones. But if you want to go in your canoe off the edge of a waterfall or go through thin ice, that's up to you.
Where was the elk?
It was at the bottom of the center one.
No, but what town or what area?
Yeah, they're very beautiful, the drawings and the quality of the little markings that they use to describe different kinds of landforms. And some of them I find really funny too, like the Banff tourist map had downhill skiing, cross-country skiing, the graveyard, in that order. And then it had figure skating, the hospital. I just find those kind of things inadvertently funny. So one of the things in all my research and reading about maps is that maps always have an agenda. Doesn't matter who makes them, there's always somebody behind it who edits the information, who decides what goes in there. So I think someday it might be fun to make a map from the animal's point of view, if that were possible. A talk for the Textile Society of America on that project, so you can see my selected bibliography. So there's a lot of stuff I looked at. This was my dad's boat in the 1960s. The red and white striped sail was my favorite. They could recognize us from a long way away. And for years, I imagined making sails as a gallery installation. No boat, no sound, just these sails looking like they're going somewhere. And my dad died 3 or 4 years ago, and I started working on it as a kind of an homage to him. In reading about sails, I found this website. Christer Westerdahl recounts how the Norse god Freyr had a mythical ship which was always blessed with fair winds. Once ashore, it could be folded up and put into a purse. And this echoes how sails can expand to enormous shapes, and yet they can be folded into small sailbags. Sails share the fate of many historical textiles in that they're not durable, but they exist in legend and art. The idea of decoration on sails also appealed to me, the idea of the blank canvas, but also, as with the striped jib, on how sails announced something. For de Gama's fleet, it was the Christ cross and the sail. Here they are busy sinking. I think 5 out of the 6 disappeared. There was the form itself also that spoke of the identity of the nationality of the ship. So there's the old saying that an old salt might say, "I like the cut of your jib." And he might refer to a Chinese junk rig or a Brazilian Ugada, which you can see the etching on the left is 400 years ago, and it looks the same now. There are also Filipino vintas, which have patchwork that looks like Seminole patchwork, and the Grand Banks fishing schooner with their sexy high-cut Yankee foresails. To mark the class of a racing sailboat, there are very specific logos placed in the top third of the mainsail. So in racing events, when there are a lot of boats that are identical, they have to differentiate them somehow. So they'll put the nation's flags on there. But sometimes the decoration is more than just simple identification. This is a Thames barge, and as late as 1903, a joint select committee of Lords and Commons estimated that 75 to 80% of the whole traffic of London was carried by barges. And I ran across this photo. I thought, well, this chap here running his Thames barge back and forth from one bank to the other was maybe paid by the Eastwoods brickmakers to make his sails into a floating billboard. And that began what's now quite common, with racing boats putting their sponsors' logos digitally onto their sails. So as I was looking at all these images of sails, I was thinking, okay, so I want to make sails, and if I decorate them, what am I advertising? What am I talking about on the sails? I was awarded a small BC Arts Council grant to learn to make sails, and I worked with Rob Rose of Rose Sailmakers in Duncan, BC. He keeps trying to retire, but people keep asking him to make sails for him. And he learned in the Royal Navy and in London, and he's very particular about how things are done. And of course, it's like any craft, it's a lifetime of learning how to do something. And I certainly didn't expect to become an expert, but he walked me through some basic things. And sails are not just flat triangles, they're formed like an airfoil. So if you think of an airplane wing stuck on its end, they actually lift the boat forward. So Rob helped me make these drawings, and he calculated how much to taper the seams at the ends, because it makes kind of a belly in the sail. And then I lofted them out on my apartment floor. They're 12 feet tall, so I just had enough room. I used the Sailmakers Apprentice book, which I brought here, and there's another book on sailmaking over there that describe the procedure and different ways of finishing them. There you can see the baggy bit in the middle is the belly of the sail. It was really exciting because as you're making it, you're not quite sure if you're doing it right or whether it will look right. And then Rob showed me how to finish them, like to put the crinkles in and the rope reinforcing on the edges. And I'm sure it's the most amateurish job he's ever seen, but I gave it a go. And then I had my prototypes, so I took them to a park and set them up. I continued to draw and think about what should adorn them. And I went back to the tide atlas, which I had used with the drawings of the ship hulls. So the first set, there's a tide atlas. The fat arrows are where the tide goes fast, and then the skinny ones are not so fast. But where it goes fast in the ebb might not be where it goes fast in the flow. So that's the first one, called tides. And I was thinking about how reading the tide tables, Dad always had the tide tables with us. The idea of making use of a shared language, how mariners use a shared language to read both the book and the landscape. And the safety of the crew depends on knowing this, because if you're stuck where the tide's ripping through things, you could wind up ashore. I had to design embroidery that worked from both sides, because these are sculptural, you can walk around them. So I made samples which it's being exhibited right now at the Grand Forks Gallery, so all the samples are there for people to look at. The second one was taken from a pilot chart that was reproduced in the end papers of a book by Eric Hiscock, old tattered book over there. You can find pilot charts online now, and they cover a whole ocean, not just a region, but a whole ocean. And the thing that I think is really cool about pilot charts is that the reddy-orange lines are barometric pressure, and the green lines are ocean currents, and then these funny sort of windrows things are mariners will report, I forget the acronym now, but there's a central clearinghouse where they will report the wind direction, where they are, and when. And then a central place compiles this, and then they funnel all that information to make the pilot charts. So a pilot chart is actually something that many, many mariners have contributed to. And so the long tails on the windrows will be where the wind comes from the most often, and then the little short stubby ones comes from there sometimes. So you can see that they're all slightly different, but in certain areas, like in the middle of the ocean and the trade winds, the long tails will be quite predictable. The third set, I started thinking about how observing weather when you're a sailor was crucial. My dad had a really keen eye for what was going on around us minute by minute. It mattered, because if you weren't paying attention, things could happen quite quickly. And if you have too much sail on your sailboat and the big squall of wind hits you, it can rip the mast right out of your boat. So he was always much more attuned to it than my mother and I. I started borrowing field guides to clouds, and I downloaded cloud apps onto my iPhone. And every time I see a cool formation, I'll take a picture, and I'm starting to compile my own little cloud atlas. And I like the use of the word atlas, intimately linking clouds and weather to geography. I did drawings and made samples, again, trying to figure out how to make this two-sided. So these are both sides. And it's just an in and out running stitch. You'll notice I'm not talking about how-to books, and the library is full of those. They have great how-to books. I think sometimes I go to those. I usually go to people more often to ask how to do something. A set of sails called Clouds. And I used, I was very fond of this image in Hiscock's book where the boat is going downwind and it's got the two jibs symmetrically. I just like the shape of it. So there's the detail of the clouds. Like, it looks really neat when the light is shining behind it, because you can see the thread behind the canvas and it begins to look like a line drawing. Finally, I wanted to represent how sailors then and now have to know how to do repairs. And when I saw this picture, I just thought how working on a ship in those days must have been like some kind of extreme sport, except nobody's standing there with Gatorade and Band-Aids, waiting to patch you up. So imagine climbing up the mast and then climbing out onto the yardarm and striking sail with this hurricane blowing around you. I came across images of boats that were just a galaxy of patches, and there's no Walmart to put into to get a new sail when you're out on the ocean. In those times, the sailmakers had to patch, and I'm sure they took spare sails, and then they used the ripped up ones to patch spare ones until at the end of the voyage they looked like this. I was reading Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and I came across this passage where he describes seeing a railway car full of torn sails en route to being shredded to make paper. He says, "Who can write so graphically the history of storms they have weathered as these rents have done?" So it was like a boxcar full of storms. Once I'm working on a project, my antennae are up for anything that feeds into it. Author Derek Harvey wonders why most ships had only one sailmaker, because the work must have been unending. So here's the poor guy, no machine, he's patching and patching and patching. So this set of sails I called Storms, and I used damaged table linen and canvas scraps I had from making the other sails. On a lot of sails you can see reef points, which are these little strings hanging down, and shortening the sail area in heavy winds is really crucial. Dad made me this birthday card when, where'd it go? It's gone. Anyway, he used the tiny sail we had for our rowboat to keep us going rather than have a big sail up. But by reefing a sail, you tie the little strings around the boom and then pull the sail down, and it makes it smaller. So you can see this boat, he's done it not elegantly, but he's reefed the sail so that he's got less sail area, and it makes it easier on the boat and the crew in rough weather. So I reefed the patch sails to really have the idea of the storm. Oh, there's Dad's room. And racing sailors will keep their sails up as long as they can to get maximum speed, but I guess this is the equivalent of what my son would call a face plant in mountain biking. Craft Council comes in because you're part of a community then, and there's so many opportunities and events that they put on for you that let you have shop talk and meet with other people. So please have a look at the work. Please don't touch it. I've got samples here that you can feel guilt-free, and there are books and some catalogs from the Sail project. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks for coming. Because embroidery is so slow, that if I actually launch into something, it's going to take me a long time. So it has to be something that engages me. Yeah. But I keep sketchbooks where I draw, I post pictures, I write, I scribble. So I think those kind of workbooks are invaluable. I go back to them, the old ones. There's always interesting stuff in there. Yeah.
Am I being unduly negative that the site of a sailboat, big Coca-Cola sign on the sail, making you react negatively?
Well, it's money, right? That's why racing sailors do that.
It's aesthetically expensive.
Yes, well, I'm not presenting it as fine art. I'm showing an example of how they decorate sails now. Yeah, I don't think it's aesthetic either.
I should say, I love how you document your life. I've never seen anyone else doing that. But whatever happens to you is in a notebook, it's somewhere, and it comes out somewhere, so I'm just totally impressed.
Well, writers do that, and dancers and
Yeah,
musicians.
but I've never seen anybody embroidering that.
Oh, sure. The textile world is full of people that do interesting narrative things. Come to the Craft Council, we'll introduce you to more. Yes, there will be a series of talks for the Craft Council, so keep an eye on their website. Yeah. Oh, in 1967 it was Centennial Year in Canada, and all my friends were going to Expo, and I was insanely jealous. And back when schools had art teachers, like dedicated art teachers, we had an art teacher who started this tapestry, and it's on my list of things to do. I want to find out what happened to it. But it had all kinds of historical things about Canadian history, and it had all the flowers of the provinces. And if you wanted to, she would show you how to embroider, and you could work on it. And once she showed me how to do that chain stitch, where you pack those stitches together, I never looked back. I never outgrew it. So yeah, my mom and grandmothers always made stuff. My dad made stuff, and I think learning from them to invent things, like they didn't often use patterns. They would just think, okay, this is how big it has to be, and this is what color I want. And I think I learned from them that you don't need to follow a pattern, you just make stuff. And actually, in many ways, it's easier to make stuff up. So that combined with the art teacher showing me how to do some of those stitches. So.